Hi everyone, and welcome to this online rally hosted by Socialist Alternative. My name is Sarah Rack. I'll be chairing the event this evening. So far, over 26,000 people have died as a result of the coronavirus. 20% of the world's population are thought to be living under rules designed to enforce social distancing, and they think that we might have to live with these measures for up to 18 months. It's the elderly, the sick, the vulnerable, the poor who are suffering the heaviest price for this crisis. And it's predicted that 25 million jobs may be lost as a result worldwide of the recession that has been sparked by this health crisis. And while capitalist governments around the world have flapped and floundered, we've seen really inspiring ways that ordinary people have come together, shown their solidarity. And I think we particularly saw that on full display last night with the Clap for NHS Workers event. Now, that we say that there was nothing inevitable about this health crisis being so catastrophic, and there's certainly nothing inevitable about things going back to the way they were once it's over. So tonight we're going to be discussing the role of the capitalist system in this situation and how a socialist world can offer a better future for all. I want to invite everyone to get involved in the discussion and the debate in the comment thread on this feed, but don't stop there. That shouldn't be your only involvement. Clearly, at the moment, it's difficult for us to organise in traditional ways, but we have to be clear that social distancing cannot mean passivity. To defend our health, our jobs, our pay, and our democratic rights, we have to be more active than ever, even if in innovative ways, as we're showing this evening. So most importantly, if you agree with the speakers that you're about to listen to, if you want to join them and thousands of others around the world fighting for a socialist alternative to the chaos of capitalism, then join us. You can go to socialistalternative.net or fill in the Google form that's being posted in the comment thread now. Leave your details so that we can get in touch, we can invite you to our future events, and we can arrange an online discussion about what it means to be a member of Socialist Alternative. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. If there's one thing that the whole of society is united about at the moment, it's the heroic role being played by health workers, not just here, but around the world. But it's vital that we emphasise that the enormous pressure that is on health workers now was not an inevitability, and that we point out the hypocrisy of a government now putting on a pedestal a group of workers that it has denigrated over decades through attacks on their pay and working conditions. Jacqui B is an intensive care nurse and also a member of the national executive of the Unison trade union, which represents many health workers, although she is speaking this evening in a personal capacity. So over to you, Jacqui.
Oh, well, thanks, Sarah. I'd just like to reiterate these are my personal opinions. I'm not representing my employer or my union. And I've been an intensive care nurse for 7 years now. It's never, ever been an easy job looking after people on life support. I have grown up in a national health service, which has been subject to a decade of austerity. So last night when Boris Johnson, who has fully supported every cutback, every service sell-off, every act to suppress the wages of healthcare workers, stood outside 10 Downing Street and joined in a mass applause for us. Well, it was frankly just hypocrisy. There's a lot of hype about us in the media at the moment, and the truth is that we're not heroes or angels or celebrities that need applause. We are workers who are doing a very difficult job to the best of our ability, just like all of the other workers in supermarkets, on public transport, doing less glamorous jobs like broadband and sewage. We are the working class, and we're the people who have proven ourselves to be indispensable to society. And I don't want to be sort of too bar humbug about the mass applause that took place last night, because I tell you, when you go out into onto your doorstep, into your community, and the whole street is there clapping and cheering with kids and pots and pans, you realise how much power collectively we have, and what we could do if we decided to channel it in the right direction, into a direction to achieve what it is that we need. So what is it that we need at the moment? First of all, we need adequate personal protective equipment for all workers that are coming into close contact with the general public. It is essential not just for the health and safety of individuals, but also to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Not only have the government failed at a national level to plan and supply adequate PPE to people who are looking after those with known or suspected COVID-19, they've completely overlooked the fact that this is a virus which can be spread by people who have got no symptoms whatsoever. That puts all health and social care workers who sometimes come into contact with hundreds of people every single week into a very vulnerable position. And this has been compounded by the fact that up until about an hour and a half ago, unless you were admitted to hospital because you couldn't breathe, or you are rich, famous and willing to pay, you cannot get a test. If you're Prince Charles, you can get tested. If you're Boris Johnson, you can get tested. If you're a nurse caring for a critically unwell COVID patient, you can now finally, congratulations, get tested. But if you're a porter going from hospital ward to hospital ward, you can't get tested. If you deliver post or stack shelves in Tesco or work in a call centre for a gas and electric company, you can forget about it. And that's not because your body is any more durable to the coronavirus. It is not because you are less likely to infect other people. It's because in a capitalist society, it's one rule for the wealthy, and it is another for the millions of working class people who toil every day to keep the show on the road. The only reason that the government today have caved and said that workers in critical care environments can now get tested is, first of all, because there are trusts in London where half the staff are off sick, but secondly, because they're absolutely terrified of a public backlash when healthcare workers are getting sick and potentially dying of coronavirus, because they saw the popularity and the support that the public hold the NHS in last night. And why is it that testing has been so strictly rationed in the first place, when all of the evidence from the World Health Organization says test, test, test? It's because the NHS, despite the fact that it is the envy of the world in terms of its ability to deliver a publicly funded universal healthcare system, it has been underfunded for decades, while successive governments have pursued programme after programme of privatisation. And this has meant that the system is stretched to burst in normal times. So now, in the midst of a pandemic, NHS labs which test samples are unable to cope with this additional pressure. And what this means in practice is that people who may or may not have the coronavirus in hospital are cohorted and nursed alongside people who do. And they wait sometimes 5, 6, 7 days, sometimes longer, for results. So if you didn't have it at the start, there's a very good chance you'll have it at the end of it. And we're starting to see this week now cases of hospital-acquired COVIDs, which is inevitable in a system which is under the kind of pressure that an austerity hit National Health Service is feeling under the impact of this pandemic. We face a very real possibility of widespread infection of staff. today there was an article about some meetings which took place way back in 2017 when Jeremy Hunt was the Health Secretary, in which it was decided to downgrade the guidelines about the level of PPE that workers should have access to when looking after respiratory viruses, and reduce stockpiling to cut costs. So we were not in a great position to start with, but the problems of getting PPE onto the bodies of the workers who need it have been hugely exacerbated by the fact that there is an internal market which exists within the National Health Service. Local trusts compete with one another for business, but they also procure all of their supplies separately, which in itself is a really mad, inefficient system. But it gets worse because private companies are really keen to sell stuff to the NHS at the moment because they know we need it. And there's a lot of companies at the moment making different FFP3 masks, which are the masks that protect people from inhaling particles of coronavirus. But the fact there's loads of companies producing them doesn't actually make it any easier to get those masks onto the faces of the workers who need it, because each worker has to be fitted and tested on each different company's mask, and you don't know which mask is going to be there from 1 week to the next. You don't know if there is going to be a suitable mask for you, and that is in areas where the PPE has been accessible. PPE has been accessible, by the way, through the sheer determination and hard work of the workers on the ground, not because Matt Hancock has decreed that it would be so, or because the market, a system for producing and distributing goods by private companies to make profit, is a system that works. It's not. It is an absolutely terrible system which is having catastrophic real life consequences, including loss of life for ordinary blameless people across the planet. So the question really becomes, what can we do about this? There is an immediate need for PPE and for testing. No overnight injection of funds is going to reverse the decades of underfunding and structural privatisation that has taken place, not just in our NHS, but across all of our sort of interdependent public services. We need an expansion of the National Health Service to include production and distribution of medical supplies, not leaving it to the likes of James Dyson and other Tory mates who want to flog us some gear. Who should make the decisions about what gets made, when and how? That should be under the democratic control of the people who do the work. In a few short weeks, the workers who were low skilled have become essential. And it's been demonstrated in the clearest possible terms who it is we need as a society. You've only got to look at the stock markets to see what happens when workers stop working. It's workers who produce wealth. It's workers who keep society going. It's not landlords or investors or banks. And actually, out of this crisis, it's we as working class people that will need to come up out of it, not just asking for a little bit more money for the NHS or a pay rise here and there, but demanding a society that is driven by the health and well-being of people and our planet, and that puts the power and wealth into the hands of all of us collectively to run in our own interests. This kind of society is a socialist society. It's a socialist world that we in Socialist Alternative are striving for. So if you're on the live stream and you're not a member, I urge you to get in touch today. This is a really frightening time, and I think I speak for all workers when I say we are at the start of what is likely to be a very, very rough ride indeed, but it's not forever. And there is a tomorrow. If you want that to be a socialist tomorrow, then I urge you to join us, because we've got a world to win. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jacqui. I'm sure that everyone watching joins me in sending solidarity to Jacqui and all her fellow health workers in their battle against this virus. and also in all the battles, as Jacqui just described, that will come afterwards to fight for an NHS fit for purpose. Now, we're currently experiencing a global health crisis and a global economic crisis. In recent years, we've seen global movements on issues from climate change to war to women's rights. And I think it's never been clearer that the struggle for a decent future for all and for the planet is an international one. So Socialist Alternative is part of International Socialist Alternative, with members in more than 30 countries around the world. This coming Sunday night, ISA is hosting its own online rally with speakers from Italy, Hong Kong, the US and Ireland. And we'll be sharing that through the Socialist Alternative page on Sunday at 7 p.m. You can read more about ISA at internationalsocialist.net, including responses and updates from many, many countries around the world on the current coronavirus situation. And that includes some really excellent analysis from Italy, which has clearly been one of the hardest hit places so far. And our next speaker has seen the tragedy in Italy unfold firsthand. Giuliano Bruneti is a socialist activist in our sister organisation in Italy, and will speak now on the crisis there and how workers are responding. So welcome, Giuliano.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for having me. Today, almost 1,000 people died out of coronavirus in Italy. And that concretely means that we have over 9,000 people that have died since the beginning of this pandemic. There are 18,000 people that are infected, and those are the official statistics. But unfortunately, the reality is far worse. The Civil Protection Unit that is fighting the pandemic estimates that just 1 sick people out of 10 is officially registered and monitored. Concretely, that would mean that there may be less than 1 million people infected in Italy, and the reality could be even worse. The reality is that tests are not being done. There have been just 114,000 tests being carried. And of course, those statistics are very cold, and they don't really give a picture of what is the reality in certain areas. But we need to consider that in certain municipalities, the mortality rate is so high that every family is actually mourning a dead person. And in this situation, people are asked to stay at home and to wait for their symptom to pass, because there is not staff in hospital able to head them. There was a case of a woman in a popular working class area in the city of Naples. She's the wife of a person that was extremely sick. He has been extremely sick for days, and they've been desperately trying to get some help, phoning 112, trying to stop police patrol on the streets, and no one helped them. So at the end, this woman laid on the ground and started screaming for hours to get attention. And it's the only way that she managed actually to get a test for her husband. And the situation is a situation in which the NHS is unable to provide tests, but private companies are starting to produce them and to export them. And it's of course a real scandal if you consider that 10% of hospital workers are infected and they continue to work without actually being treated or tested. So the health system is collapsing. There are 14 doctors that have already died, and 3 nurses that have committed suicide out of pressure, out of the fear of having infected others with their heroic work. Everything is lacking, not only tests, but also reagents, microscopes, tunics, masks, respirators. Everything is missing. And you need to consider that 9 people out of 10 that are dying, for example, in Lombardy, they died before being able to get to the hospital unit. So Italy has been hit severely for a whole variety of reasons, but essentially what has happened is that the 37 billion euro of cuts that have been carried out by neoliberal government in the last 20 years have aggravated the situation, as has the federalization of the health sector, in a situation where we have now in Italy more than 20 different health sectors, one per region, and in certain area, like the autonomous province of Bolzano and Trento, they have their own system, and we are speaking about cities essentially. To give just an idea of the consequences of the cuts, in 1981 there were 500,000 beds in public hospitals. Today there are 191,000. And in Lombardy, which is at the epicenter of the crisis, it's the region where Milano is, 40% of the beds are in private facilities. And of course, there is the epidemic, but there are also silent aspects of this tragedy. For example, people dying massively and alone in old people's homes. For example, horrible repression developing in prisons. For example, the fact that domestic violence is increasing, suicide are increasing, but also compulsory health treatment are increasing. And it's basically the idea that police can calm someone down using violence and sedatives on a mentally sick person. And that has risen in the region of Turin, it has been multiplied by 10 compulsory health treatment. Another aspect of this crisis is that the whole system is confronting the pandemic, and concretely that means that, for example, heart attacks are not treated. Hospitalization for heart attack have been halved in the last months. And of course, this is not because people have stopped having heart attack, but because emergency units are full and ambulances are not being able to answer. So now almost every day the government is implementing new decrees with further restrictions, and we have a whole variety of means that are being used for repression, drones, army patrolling the streets, and that has led to unbelievable situations, such as the situation in where homeless people are being fined because they are not staying at home. The fines are gone up to 4,000 euros. And for those that violate the rules against contagion, for example, those that leave their house being in quarantine, and then they risk going to jail up to 5 years. So now the government is trying, of course, to criminalize individual workers, to criminalize old women going to the grocery store twice a week, to criminalize a young worker going to run a bit around his house. And this criminalization goes hand in hand with the development of an authoritarian system in our country. Of course, the responsible of the pandemic are the bosses. We need to be extremely clear about that. They have decided that the factory needs to remain open, that business needs to be done as usual, and there has been a massive response of millions of working class people against this situation, with spontaneous strikes that have been self-organized against the will of the top leadership of the union. And it has been an impressive wave of strike. On Wednesday, for example, in the metal worker sector in the region of Bergamo had a strike, and the strike was followed by 9 workers out of 10. The same amount could be said about the strikes developing in the chemical sector. And that is really showing a way to the whole of the population. But now the situation has unfortunately changed, because strikes have been banned till April 13. And unfortunately, this wave of strike has been completely sold out by the union bureaucracy that have agreed with the bosses to continue production. So officially now all non-essential sectors have been closed, but we need to understand what is essential for the government in this situation, because, for example, printing and production of recorded media is continuing. Manufacturing of plastic production is continuing. Financial and insurance activities are continuing. Call center activities are continuing. Paper making is continuing. Until yesterday, they were still continuing the production of F-35 fighter planes. So now the situation is a situation where 30% of the workforce is still working. And this situation is also leading to a transformation of the role of the powers inside the state. Now it's the prefects, which are directly responsible to the Minister of the Interior, that decide what can stay open and what can close in a context where several authoritarian measures are being taken. Of course, we don't know how the pandemic will last, but we do know that there will be a devastating economical crisis after that. And we do know, and workers understand, that they will be left with nothing, that millions will lose their jobs, that no one will be left in the situation that existed before. And now we are in a situation where we have huge fear and desperation, but this fear is already transforming into anger. For example, in the city of Palermo in Sicily, yesterday, there was a group of family, 14 people, that went to a supermarket and they decided that they were not going to pay for their food because they had no money to pay for their food. And now police is being used to patrol the areas around the supermarket because people are actually angry, in the sense that we are facing almost a mass starvation situation. We know that they will try to make us pay for their crisis. The estimation are that Italy will collapse, the GDP of Italy will collapse from 6 to 10% in 2020. And of course, that will mean that the leading class will be forced to try to come together with a national unity government to implement harsh austerity, but also to avoid a social revolution, a social upheaval from below. And we will need to resist with bold initiatives, but also with a radical program, starting with basic demands. We need 13 billion to be put into the public health immediately. We need to immediately nationalize all the private companies, all the private health sector, starting from the giant of the pharmaceutical industry that are still making profit in this situation, and it is a scandal. But also we need a general wage for the millions of workers that are left at home without any kind of benefits and without actually even the perspective of having a job when the pandemic will be ended. And in order to avoid mass starvation and poverty, we really need to think of a way to get out of capitalism, to democratically plan the economy under workers' control, and to build an economy where the interest of ordinary people, of ordinary family, comes before the profit of billionaires.
Thank you very much, Giuliano, for joining us, and solidarity to all members of ISA in Italy and also to the struggles of ordinary people that you're supporting there. I'd like to, at this point, just take a moment to ask that if you are enjoying this rally and if you've enjoyed the other videos and the content that we've been putting out in recent weeks, that you consider making a donation to Socialist Alternative now. While it's more difficult at the moment for us to be out campaigning and fundraising on the streets in the same way as we usually are, we still have standing costs to meet. And I think it's already clear from this discussion, the need for a socialist message to be out there has never been greater. We don't receive any rich backing. We rely entirely on support from workers and young people like you. We know that many people have already financially been hit by this crisis. And we're being really truthful when we say that the small donations are just as important to us as the bigger ones. Maybe you might be able to donate the cost of a drink you might have had in the pub on a usual Friday night if you weren't attending this rally, if the lockdown wasn't taking place. But maybe some others of you might be receiving some extra overtime payments, for example, and be able to afford a bit more. Can you give £10, £50, even £100? We promise that every single pound will be put to good use, building a socialist resistance against Johnson's government and the capitalist system that they prop up. You can donate now by clicking the donate button on our homepage at socialistalternative.net, which should be posted in the comment thread below in the feed here now. It's now time for our final speaker this evening to explain Socialist Alternative's approach to the coronavirus pandemic and what it reveals about the capitalist system. Welcome Claire Laker-Mansfield from the Socialist Alternative Political Committee.
Okay, well, thank you. And obviously, as the last two speakers have very clearly outlined, we're living in exceptional times, in very dramatic times, in very dark times. And obviously there have been some very tragic human stories that have emerged over the last week in Britain of people who have been victims of this disease. But I think we've also seen some inspiring stories this week of sacrifices made by ordinary working class people, of solidarity. And I think that most of all, perhaps what we have to say about these times that we live in is that these are times in which the necessity of working class people being organised, and crucially being organised around socialist ideas, has never been greater. This is a crisis which is multifaceted. First and foremost, it's a public health crisis on a global scale, possibly the worst public health crisis that humanity has faced since the Spanish flu after the First World War. Today in Britain, we've had the news, which Jacqui mentioned, that our Prime Minister himself, as well as the Health Secretary, have both been infected. And of course, we don't wish ill health on anybody. But in a way, it's an illustration of the complacency with which this issue has been approached by the ruling class, by the capitalist class, and by the Tory party itself. Johnson chose to prioritise profit, prioritise keeping our economy going as long as possible over any serious action to stop the spread of the virus. That approach was even formulated as a strategy. It's now infamous, the so-called herd immunity approach, or perhaps more accurately, you might call it the if a few pensioners die, then so be it approach, as christened allegedly by Dominic Cummings, Johnson's chief advisor. In reality, what that strategy represented was a conscious willingness to let older and more vulnerable people die in order to try and keep profits rolling into the pockets of big businessmen, of top executives, and so on. Johnson has now been forced by the weight of public opinion, but I think also very importantly, by the action of key groups of workers. Working class people have already had an impact on what is happening in this crisis, especially, for example, the teachers who demanded action, who demanded closures in the interests of safety. And they were a crucial part of changing the course of the Tory government's approach to this and forcing them into a position of starting to try and take measures to slow the spread. One thing I would say is that we shouldn't rule out that there can be a return to that old herd immunity strategy. If you look at what Donald Trump is saying at the moment, he's clearly looking over his shoulder at China, where the economy is starting to reopen. There, we're seeing a potential approach of going back to reopening things, allowing the virus to spread again, and a similar strategy being adopted. So we have to guard against that kind of complacent approach being something which is taken. But I think we also have to say that it is not inherent within the biological properties of coronavirus that this has developed into a global pandemic. We understand as human beings, and the scientists and the technique that we have, we understand how viruses like this spread. We know how to test for them. We know how to isolate people and quarantine in order to stop them spreading. We know how to make vaccines for viruses of this kind. And yet, just about every capitalist government who has been faced with this challenge, preventing the development of an epidemic, has signally failed to do that. Even the initial transfer of this virus from animal to human is thought to have been preventable. It relates to the question of safe and sustainable food production. And of course, criminally, the Chinese regime initially covered up this virus. They persecuted the doctors responsible. And that's worth remembering, I think, because one of the things that's being discussed now, and Giuliano mentioned it, is the idea that what we need to combat this virus is a beefing up of state power. We need the state to be able to act in a more repressive way against working class people who might be irresponsible. Those kinds of ideas are out there. But it's worth remembering that it was state repression which had a major role in allowing this outbreak to get started. But even once that initial outbreak had taken place, there were numerous opportunities to contain it. And the majority of scientists agree that one of the most important things is the widespread availability of testing, of the proper provision of quarantine facilities, of an aggressive approach to identifying cases, tracing their contacts, slowing the spread. And that is, of course, the exact opposite of what is happening here, even now. We have extremely restricted testing, lack of resources, complacency, and incompetence. And of course, as Jacqui outlines, there's testing for some. The rich and famous have very quick access. We've had an NHS, which is now having to deal with this, which is a service which has been on a starvation diet in reality for 10 years. And I echo and endorse all of Jacqui's points that she's made on that service. I think we also should broaden out the discussion a bit, because it's now not only a public health crisis, it's an economic crisis and it's a social crisis. It's an economic crisis which looks set potentially to be as bad as that of the 1930s. We have economists estimating in Britain that we could have GDP fall between 8% and 15%. And of course, it's true that COVID-19 has in one sense caused and triggered the crisis, but it's also exposed the huge frailties that already existed in capitalist economies, in the world economy, and especially in Britain. The unresolved contradictions of 2008, a system which had become increasingly reliant for economic growth on cheap money, on unprecedented injections of liquidity, quantitative easing, on the inflation of bubbles and debt bubbles of 10 years in which a minority of the world's population, a tiny minority, have enjoyed unparalleled increases in their wealth, eye-watering sums accumulated by the few at the top. Meanwhile, the vast majority of working class people have had a decade of, at best, stagnation in terms of living standards, and at worst, an increasing drive towards precarity in work, in housing, and so on. And all of this now precedes what is going to be an even bigger economic collapse than we witnessed in 2008. We've had a Tory government forced to intervene to stave off complete catastrophe, to save their own system, to try and stop mass revolt from developing in a short space of time. And in order to do that, they've had to throw out their own rule book. Things that we were told were impossible Marxist nonsense, like nationalising the railways, have suddenly become an urgent necessity for Boris Johnson to carry out, because the private sector cannot cope with shocks of this kind. Money that apparently didn't exist has suddenly been found in order to try and stop complete collapse in terms of jobs and so on. And they have been forced to take these measures. But it has to be said that we still face an absolute catastrophe for many, many working class people, despite those measures that have been taken. They're not adequate and they aren't enough. We had a story today in the press about the problem of hunger in this crisis. There are some estimates now that it could be up to 8 million people who will need food aid from charities just over the next few weeks. There's an unprecedented disaster in terms of people losing their jobs. We haven't had proper figures. Some other countries have released figures already about how many people have been laid off. I think it's 400,000 in Ireland, for example. There's just been a survey. That's the only information we have so far. But that suggests that around 5% of people have lost their jobs in the last month in Britain. Absolutely devastating. And the Tories have, of course, got huge responsibility for this. They're taking measures now which may assist in preventing some layoffs, but they're doing that by piling up public debt. And one of the things that is going to be a question as we start to emerge from this crisis, whenever that starts to happen, and as the economy starts to reopen, one of the questions that there is going to be is who is going to pay for this? And inevitably, there is going to be an attempt by the Tories, by the rich, to make working class people foot the bill for this crisis, like they did the last time. But one thing I will say is that I don't think that doing that will be as easy as they thought. Because one of the things that this crisis has dramatically brought to light and exposed is some of the key truths about capitalism as a system. First of all, as Jacqui outlined, it's revealed who really creates wealth in society. If all the bankers and all the top executives had decided to work from home or take holiday for the last month, nobody would have batted an eyelid. Working class people are the ones who actually create wealth. And not just that, it's workers who run society in all of the most important ways. Health workers are rightly getting tremendous praise, but as Jacqui said, it's not just them. It's people working in overtime in supermarkets, in factories, it's bin men, it's postal workers and so on. And it's all the people who were told for a decade didn't deserve a pay rise, had fat cat, gold-plated pensions and so on. Now those are the people who we're supposed to be clapping and cheering for, and rightly so. And those are people crucial to running society. And we're people with power. That's, I think, more clear than it was before this crisis. What's needed now urgently is planning, and it needs to be working class people who are making the plan, not the rich. The market is chaotic. We've talked a little bit today about how it's failing in terms of producing the things that we need. The fact that we have companies around the world and capitalist governments looking at vaccines, all doing separate research, and capitalist governments desperately trying to get them together so that they can pool the research and come to a conclusion quicker, but all of them instead preferring to act independently, wanting to be the first people to get it to make the biggest profit rather than to get a vaccine as quickly as possible. Working class people would have dramatically different priorities. And we've also seen a situation in which Johnson has said, despite all of his failings, you have to trust me. I'm going to make the decisions about when we close the schools. I'm going to make the decisions about when things are reopened, if they are. I'm going to enforce measures which I think are necessary through state power. And I think we should be saying, actually, it should be working class people who are making the decisions about what measures are taken to prevent this COVID outbreak from worsening. It should be the people on the front line, in our health service, in our NHS, in schools, in all areas of essential work, for example, that Johnson is now praising. Those are the people who should be making democratic decisions along with the rest of the community about what measures are taken and how they're enforced. And we have to say that things can't go back to normal. We need socialist change. We need public ownership of our NHS, of our railways, of our supermarkets, of our food supply chains to make sure people are put before profit. And we need public ownership over all the monopolies which dominate our economy and which have willingly gambled with the lives of millions of people when it comes to this. Sports Directs of the world, the Weatherspoons, the people who are putting their own workers at risk and all of us at risk. They should not be allowed to continue to make big money after this. And we need to plan an economy which works for the majority, where working class people are not forced to pay for the crisis, where rather than a dramatic fall in living standards, we have a decade and a future in which ordinary people can enjoy improvements in their lives and can enjoy the things that they need so desperately: decent healthcare, decent jobs, decent homes, the basics which everyone deserves and which our society in the 21st century must be able to provide. So I want to finish by echoing Sarah's appeal to join Socialist Alternative, because we need you. We need ordinary working class people who are active in their workplaces, who are part of the struggle in their communities, to join with us in the fight for socialist change, the change that we need to see.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thanks again to all our speakers this evening. Just to continue where Claire left off, I want to also appeal to you, don't leave your involvement at just watching us and supporting what we're saying in this rally this evening. join us. Socialist Alternative is organised across the country. In this situation, our branches are holding weekly online meetings, organising social media activity, discussing what demands are necessary, what actions are necessary, discussing likely future developments. We're part of and leading struggles and strikes by workers in different sectors, including fighting for safe working conditions in this crisis. We're active among university students and in the community support groups that have sprung up. And clearly, organising is more complicated at the moment, but it's also more needed than ever at the moment. And you can make a big difference to what we're able to do. Fill in the Google form being shared in the comment thread now, leave your details, and one of our members will be in touch to discuss with you. And finally, I just say, make sure that you're following us on social media. We'll definitely be organising more future events like this, hopefully more in the future where we can take some questions from you live, where we can have more discussion between the speakers, and we'll definitely let you know about those events as soon as possible. So thanks for joining us, and solidarity to you all.